and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. I'm Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode. Now, years ago, you started a new job, and on your very first day, you were handed a flurry of papers to sign and a bound book, or at least a hefty pamphlet, your employee handbook. The handbook was a document that outlined the basics of your work with the company, from benefits to holidays to general personnel policies. And as an employee, it was your go-to for company questions. And it was typically the driest read ever. But no more. Today's employee handbooks look very different than they did back then. In fact, they're often not even books, and they're no longer just a list of rules and benefits. Modern handbooks serve as no less than a comprehensive introduction to a company's culture. And if your company hasn't updated its employee handbook in a while, you're going to want to listen to this episode. Our guest today is Ryan Golden, reporter with HR Dive, which provides in-depth journalism and insight into the most impactful news and trends shaping human resources. Ryan, welcome to Project HR.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. This is a great topic. I'm really excited to talk with you about it. Does every company need an employee handbook?
That's a great question to start off with. Prefacing my answer with the fact that even though I report on HR and employment law, I'm not an attorney myself.
Sure.
So I can't offer legal advice on this matter. But from the conversations I've had with employment law attorneys and sources, the general answer seems to be, at least at the federal level, there is no federal law stating that employers must have an employee handbook. Obviously, it's a best practice for a few reasons, I think, and it's certainly useful to have all your policies and procedures in one place, as you said in the introduction. But again, at the federal level, there doesn't appear to be a law that says you absolutely need to have an employee handbook.
So what kind of risks is an employer looking at if they don't have a handbook?
Right. In conversations with my sources, I think the biggest risk is just not having a central place for employees to go to when they have a question about a given policy or procedure. I think about very serious topics like harassment and even more policy-oriented questions like when do I get time off or when can I ask for vacation? When can I ask for a promotion? Those kinds of examples, it can be useful to have something to point to if you're talking to an employee or even if you're talking to a manager or supervisor.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So in your experience and the folks that you've talked with, what are the benefits of having an employee handbook?
Again, yeah, the benefits are just having that one place for people to go to if they have questions. It's useful to lay out sort of your philosophy on what the workplace should look like and what employment should look like at your given workplace. And it's I think one of the quotes I have gathered over the years is that it's Exhibit A. An employee handbook is Exhibit A for your vision of your policies, your workplace. It really is the beginning spot where everybody can sort of go to look all that stuff up.
Sure, and it gives us all as leaders sort of a reference point of this is where we begin to discuss whatever issue might have come up. For that's a definite benefit. So before we get into the details of how employee handbooks have evolved recently and over the past maybe decade or so, let's talk a little bit about why. What do you think prompted this shift in how we approach the handbook?
Sure. As much as I can gather, it has a lot to do with sort of our expectations around user experience. And I'm thinking specifically, looking back a decade and even further than that, at the rise of electronic devices and even the incorporation of personal devices in the workplace, things like your cell phone, your tablet, your laptop. We all want a seamless experience. We see that in shopping. We see that in other industries. HR is growing to be no different from my conversations. You're seeing folks and employees come into the office and they want to be able to look up information that they need quickly. They want an accurate place in order to sort of go and get that information. So we're seeing things like company intranets rise up, and we're seeing different documents that aren't your traditional employee handbooks sprout up. And a lot of these examples we'll be talking about. Because I think that there is a drive for a better experience, a better employee experience.
Well, and I know in my experience, being able to have that online allows you to update and shift more quickly than you could if you had to distribute a printed piece to everybody. That's made a big difference.
That's absolutely true. Again, updating it is a lot easier if you have an electronic document to go off of.
So have you seen in your research and what you've experienced, has it become the handbook itself sort of a baseline for corporate branding? Is this what employees are going to say, okay, this is who I work for?
Right. That's a good question. I don't know about baseline for corporate branding, but I will say you certainly are on the right track when it comes to seeing employers incorporate branding into their employment documents, whether that's a handbook or maybe an onboarding document or even some sort of pamphlet or checklist that employees can go through. You'll see pictures, you'll see graphics, you'll see comics in some places detailing how employees can accomplish certain tasks, talk to their managers, take time off. You see some really creative examples out there. I'm excited to sort of get into those today.
Yeah. So the I think the recognition, and we've talked about this on the show before, of the importance of your culture and paying attention to your corporate culture. How is the recognition of that, the importance of your corporate culture, contributed to this shift in how we look at handbooks?
Right. I think the sort of emphasis that HR has placed on corporate culture, you see it in a lot of different ways. You see it in sort of the corporate social responsibility events that companies put forward. You see it in their onboarding. You see it in their sort of commercials about what it's like to work at a given company. There are a lot of ways that employer brand, as you said earlier, have been sort of injected into it, and it's created a sort of reflection of the employer's culture. I think the answer to the question is yes, we are seeing culture be more integrated into policy, into just general, talk about how the workplace works. And that's, of course, employee handbooks are, no exception. We're seeing a culture in that area as well.
And you touched on establishing policy, and obviously that's one of the goals of an employee handbook. But obviously, in recent years, we've seen a lot of legal changes, things around harassment. Has that prompted changes within what a handbook is intended to do?
100%. The biggest employment law changes we have seen, even this year, you think about 2020 alone, we've seen a massive shift to remote work at a lot of places. We've seen a landmark Supreme Court ruling out of Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, that completely changed the employment law landscape back in earlier this year. And you've seen just a general wave of employment law attention to issues like harassment and discrimination, even not just in the past year alone, but you think, back to when I started HR Dive in 2016, we were just talking about the Me Too movement, just beginning to talk about the Me Too movement
Hmm.
and the sort of change that's wrought upon. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I've heard from my employment attorney sources has been that if you have an employee handbook, you should probably be updating it at least once per year to reflect changes in state law, federal law, local law, because as we've seen in the past few years, employment law has shifted considerably on all these levels.
So your legal contact, so they recommend an annual look at it. Should the attorney be involved at that point, or is that just something that you should do internally and kind of do an audit of the handbook, or should they hand it over to their labor and employment attorney to make sure that they're fully updated?
Yeah, I think the easiest answer to that question is just yes. Involve your compliance team at sort of every step of the way in updating your handbook. Over and over again, I've heard employment attorneys in any employment law issue, you've got to get your compliance people involved, your leadership team involved. And as you make those changes, make sure you communicate them to your workforce in a lot of different ways, not just through email, but through electronic updates, through apps if you need to, through your internal intranet, through management. There are a lot of ways to communicate those changes.
For sure. And of course, we're an employee communications company, so we talk about that all the time. All right, Ryan, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. For our listeners, when we return, we're going to get into what's possible with today's employee handbooks, what they should cover, how you can keep your company's handbook up to date. So stay with us.
Thanks to the Respectful Workplace for supporting this week's episode of Project HR. Brand new for 2020, the Respectful Workplace is online harassment prevention that connects with your workforce so you can focus on growth and success. Download our free state-by-state guide to harassment prevention at therespectfulworkplace.net and get started today.
We're back here on Project HR with HR Dive reporter Ryan Golden talking about employee handbooks. So Ryan, one of the biggest changes to the employee handbook is something that has nothing to do with its actual content, but rather with its presentation. That bound book I talked about is very rarely an actual book anymore. Is that true?
I think that's pretty accurate. You look at you do certainly see traditional examples, but as we'll get into here, there are plenty of creative takes on the traditional employee handbook.
So tell me a little bit about the options that employers might have as opposed to a real book. What have you seen out there?
I've seen lots of different things. I've seen PDFs. I've seen sort of very short onboarding documents that are handed out on the employee's desk on their first day. I've seen the traditional bound book, and of course, my sources have said as much. There's a lot of variation out there. You look at the examples we're talking about today with Tesla. You have company websites that are dedicated to onboarding, like the Motley Fool. I looked at that example beforehand. There are videos, ways to introduce leadership to the company via video, and maybe you do something like a fun skit to sort of introduce the culture to the new employee. There are a lot of things, and of course, there's tons. Like, you could have a separate podcast probably talking about the fun examples, but yeah, they're certainly there.
For sure. I've seen a couple examples where they do a video handbook, and it's basically versioned for who you are and what your responsibilities are. So you meet different people through those videos, and very creative solutions. So let's talk about the content. Is this more a discussion about what's been added to these handbooks or what's been deleted?
I don't know if it's so much about what's been deleted, but I definitely have seen addition upon addition. Talking with employment attorneys, they're constantly, advising you to update your handbooks. And to see the year that we've seen, an example of a law this year that I, didn't mention previously, but wanted to mention was the Families First Coronavirus
Hmm.
Response Act.
Hmm.
This is the first ever federal paid leave law to impact private sector employers, albeit those with fewer than 500 employees. But it's such a interesting law in that it lasts on paper until the end of the year, December 31st. So if you're an employer, do you update that traditional bound book that you're talking about to reflect that change? And I actually did an interview with a few attorneys recently on this very subject, and they said, "Well, not necessarily. There's certainly a space for temporary regulations in your employment policies. It doesn't mean you have to make a permanent addition to your handbook. It certainly means you have to notify employees that they are able to take that leave if they're eligible. But again, with a lot of these temporary COVID regulations, you see this on the federal level as well as the state and local level. A lot of these temporary regulations are going to require a more temporary solution. Whereas something like remote work, if you've moved to a mandatory remote work status and your previous policy was focused on sort of a voluntary privilege based remote work policy, then you're going to have to see more permanent changes to that if you plan to make remote work more of a permanent thing moving forward for your workforce.
Hmm. Yeah. So obviously these things are evolving now, and with all this creativity that's going into the handbooks, what's the core things that need to be included?
Oh my gosh, I just want to say everything, right? It
Hmm.
really is like you name it, it's probably in your employer handbook. Time off, legal rights that employees have in the workplace when it comes to EEO law, when it comes
Hmm.
to accommodations, even simple things like when is the company vacation or how much vacation time do you get every year? How do you accrue vacation time? I hate to harp on vacation too much, but it really is the go to example for me in HR dive in a lot of these cases. But it really is everything. You talk about organizational flow charts, how to report something to your manager, how to request a check-in, or how often check-ins are. It would probably be easier to list what's not in a handbook than what is.
Right. For sure. And I'll bet all of our listeners are writing as fast as they can right now. So that would be a good checklist to have. So in recent years, we've seen several employee handbooks held up as the example of here's the new direction for handbooks. I'm talking about companies like Valve and Zappos, and you mentioned Motley Fool and Tesla. And in fact, an article that you wrote about Tesla was what originally inspired our interest in the topic. Let's talk about these examples and what makes them stand out.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to share these examples. So, Valve is a example that I saw way, way back in 2012 before I even started reporting on HR. I read through this 2012 handbook from Valve. It's a PDF. It was reported on by a couple websites back in the day. Valve's old employee handbook, not sure if they still have the same one, but you can see these examples of comics and just these little illustrations in the handbook from some of their franchises. You see this comic, for example, on how to take the company vacation. Step one, get someone to take care of your cats. Step two, board the chartered jet. And step three and
Uh-huh.
four is just take vacation, right?
Yep.
There's this very cool company specific look at this Valve document where they tell you why your desk is on wheels. We want you to move your desk and work with people and not be tied down. So again, not just explaining how things work in the office, but these little cultural flair elements that sort of build on the branding conversation we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
Another example that I don't think was listed, but I wanted to mention, I actually, it is funny to sort of think about a employee handbook that you want to actually flip through, but I have seen them. One of my favorites is a example out of Nintendo, the video game company.
Hmm.
Their Japanese division, Nintendo of Japan, actually has a annual employee handbook that features artwork and sketches from all of their different games, sort of celebrating employees' work throughout the year. And that's interspersed with these very serious messages from executives on where the company's going and what employees can expect from the year ahead, and sort of celebrating the accomplishments employees have done. Not your traditional handbook, but again, it's a document that sort of serves to celebrate what employees have accomplished and what the organization is looking like moving forward. I love examples like that. Yeah, it really, you really can make an employee handbook what you want it to be. And again, these are also sort of onboarding documents and sort of reflection
Hmm.
based documents, but there's a lot of variety with what you can do, what you can show to employees.
Yep, love that. So most of the examples are that you talked about just now are sort of unconventional. They're creative, but Tesla's anti-handbook has been described as sometimes combative. Why do you think that is, or what does it say about the corporate world's relationship with employee handbooks?
Right. I wanted to pull up the handbook in front of me real quick so I could look at it. Yes. So this Tesla handbook, I think it really stuck out to a lot of folks, and for a lot of reasons. Right. The language is sort of unconventional from what you might expect from a typical employee handbook. I'm looking at the list of stupid stuff that is on this handbook. Right. The quote is, "If you do something stupid, depending on the circumstances, you may be coached and given another chance, or you may be asked to leave." And there's listed examples in the document of stealing, disclosing confidential information, physically hurting someone. We can't, the quote again is, "We can't afford to waste our time dealing with stupid stuff when we have so many important things to get done." Raise your hand if you've ever seen that in your employee handbook before,
Hmm.
right? Um,
Right.
it's very different. And again, not an approach that I think a lot of people would necessarily recommend. I talked to an attorney about this handbook in particular, Jonathan Wexler over at Better Price. And he
Mm.
told me that even though it's idiosyncratic and potentially very different, not necessarily including everything you want in an employee handbook, there are a lot of legal documents and procedures you want to notify employees about and allow them to have access to, I think. But again, it's very different from what you traditionally see.
For sure, yeah. So what are the advantages of this kind of novel approach?
I think what the biggest advantage was, again, when I talked to Jonathan, one of the biggest advantages, he sort of pointed to was that this is a good way for you to lay out your employment philosophy, if you will.
Mm.
If you have a sort of perspective on how employees should come to work, that they should be prepared, that they should expect A, B, and C when they come to the workplace, this may be a good document to sort of set the tone and to sort of give employees a very strong set of expectations to what they should expect when they come to the workplace, for lack of better phrasing.
Hmm.
There is, however, again, we'll get into the sort of, I guess, drawbacks of it, but again, that's sort of a strong reason to look at something like this and maybe tweak a few things in your own handbook to sort of make it more simpler, or even provide a document that could provide some of these very complex policies in a more simple way.
So you just kind of touched on, what the disadvantages might be. I mean, any caveats here? What are the dangers of a handbook that reflects a company's culture as strongly as obviously Tesla's does?
Right. I know, again, the flavor is not going to be for everyone. I think the biggest HR concern, and this was voiced by my source, is that it just doesn't include everything. It doesn't
Mm.
include a lot of the information an employee might have about, what does state law mean for me? What protections do I have under state law? What employment protections do I have under federal law? If I need to ask for leave, how do I do that? This document in particular has a very basic overview of how that might work. But again, there are a lot of details that employers might want to include that aren't on here. You know, there is a link in the document to a broader, I think, company intranet or website that employees can access at Tesla if they have questions about other policies. And I
Mhm.
certainly think that that's something you might recommend to an employer if you're an attorney. But again, it just doesn't include everything, and that's what I heard in my reporting for this story.
Yeah, and I can see that being sort of a hybrid model being the way to go, where you want to set the tone with this sort of irreverent approach, and but you still want to link to those policies and procedures and those things that you can use online and update at will. It sounds like that might be the way to go. How can a company decide if this kind of irreverent approach is appropriate for them?
Right. I wish I was privy to those conversations, but I think the biggest thing is just to think about what your culture is like and what your employees expect from their official documents. What's the tone that you typically take in meetings? How casual is your culture? We know what kind of culture are you even aiming to build? These are all questions I think you need to answer, and you really need to involve everyone in an effort like this. Every senior leader needs to be involved. You really need to take a look at your whole HR operation, talk with your managers, your recruiters. Is this part of your employer branding strategy? These are all considerations I think you would need to have in order to either recommend in order to recommend a approach like this.
I hear what you're saying. It seems like it's no longer just, oh, let HR take care of that. They'll put together the policies, and it's really bringing the whole team together and creating something that's meaningful for the company as a whole. So
Right,
that's fascinating.
right, exactly.
Ryan, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is HR Dive reporter Ryan Golden. We are back. Wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that regardless of what approach is right for a company, the process of updating the employee handbook can be truly comprehensive. Who should we involve in this effort?
Yeah, I think we need to, when we talk about changing an employee handbook, changing policies, I think you got to look at talking to your compliance staff, either your in-house compliance team or your third-party compliance team, whoever that may be. Talk to your TPAs, talk to your leadership, your executive team, speak with your recruiters and your management staff. They're going to want to say on what an employee sees when they walk into the office, whether that's in an onboarding document or whether it's in a traditional handbook. I guess the really simple answer is involve whoever is relevant to the hiring and recruiting and talent management process, but that's a lot of people. So
Mhm.
you really need to think through what aspects you're communicating with whom. And at the baseline, I would say just think about what your compliance staff will say about what's included in the handbook and make sure you're asking them what updates you might want to include. Because again, the landscape is very much changing across federal, state, and local levels for employment law.
So I'm curious, where we've talked about a lot of the different content that goes into it, a lot of the different players who should be involved. Is it still HR's responsibility, in your experience and the companies that you've talked with? Does that the responsibility for the employee handbook as a whole really still sit with HR?
I'm not really sure what the right answer for this is, but I think from my reporting and just, sort of the background I have about how these handbooks are built, I think the responsibility lies with HR, but again, it's not just that HR can really make a lot of these changes on its own. There's a lot. I think the advice and the best practice that I have heard are that you really need to involve, especially the compliance team, and you need to make sure that you've covered all of the important updates, you've covered all of the changes that you feel like you need to make. And again, you've got to involve all stakeholders in these types of things because the handbook at the end of the day crosses a lot of areas. And
Hmm.
even if it's a specific document, again, like an onboarding document, you've got to sort of involve a lot of stakeholders. And even though it's your HR's responsibility to sort of, I guess, maybe guide that in a lot of organizations, there
Hmm.
certainly is a lot of input that needs to be drawn from other places.
So let's talk about the process. When you've talked with these companies and they dig into writing a handbook either for the first time or they're updating it, what kind of processes do they go through, or what would you recommend based on what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that based on my reporting, the conversations you have with different members of the team are the most important thing. So set up regular meetings with your compliance team to talk through what the employment law updates are. Set up conversations with your talent team to see how recruiting is going and how employees and potential candidates are reacting to the employer brand you're putting forth. Do they get all the information in the process that they need? I think a lot of people are conducting surveys of their onboarding and trying to measure how employees and especially new employees are reacting to the information they're given as they walk into the workplace for the first time.
Hmm.
Again, there's a lot to think about, but at the end of the day, when you're looking at examples like Valve and Tesla and so on, I think that they've put a lot of focus on how are they introducing new employees to the workplace and what should newcomers expect when they come into the workplace. And if you put your focus there, I think that's very much where you need to start when making changes and discussing with others what changes you need to make.
So you kind of touched there on maybe meeting with your compliance team. I would even say like quarterly to make sure, hey, do we need to make these updates? Even if we're not making the update until a certain point in time, being aware of what's changed. Are there any specific considerations that companies should be aware of when they're making handbook updates?
Yeah, certainly. I think you need to take into account every legal change that has happened in this past year. Again, we've seen such a shift on every single level of employment law. And I also think, again, you need to look at how employees are responding to not only the employee experience generally, but especially that newcomer employee experience. Are they really included in the culture that you've created? How are your D&I initiatives? How are your approaches to benefits? Are you explaining things correctly? Do employees still have questions after you've had a session or a webinar explaining things? And the whole remote work dynamic, I think, changes a lot of what the typical considerations are, not just for handbooks, but for policy generally. We're not seeing each other face to face in a lot of companies, and
Mhm.
that's impacting our dynamic as HR people, but also as employees every day. So I think that you need to consider what employees are going through. What does their work-life balance look like? Are they reporting that they're having issues, staying on task? And what policy changes might you be able to make, or what suggestions or best practices might you be able to follow in order to keep up with all this change? Certainly, there are no easy questions given what this year has brought. But again, we're seeing companies rethink a lot of the practices they've had just because there is so much change, and there is a lot going on for employees.
For sure, that makes sense, and we've all experienced so much change, like you've said, and had to deal with so much. How should employers roll out a changed handbook? Have you heard anything about creative or innovative ways where they're letting employees know, hey, we've made these changes. Here's the new update.
I think that through my reporting, the biggest thing I've seen is just, communication is such an important thing with every area of HR. So, again, not just emailing out changes as they occur, but posting notices in conspicuous places. If you have a place on the internet, on the company internet, or just electronically that employees go to look up updates or news, post updates there. If you have a handbook update, if there's a new local law that employees should be aware of that gives them time off or something of that matter, make sure they're aware of it there. If you have internal forums or discussion groups or even ERGs, think about using those channels to talk about what it is you think is important for employees to know. If you have initiatives going around for certain things, I think a lot about social justice and sort of the conversations we've seen on those things. Employers, the ones we've talked to, are really using their employee resource groups and their discussion groups as a way to not only listen to employees during this time, but to get the word out about what they are doing to support all these many, many different initiatives that we've seen in the past few months.
I've seen a lot of companies where communication around that has definitely been a positive for them, being able to address those concerns. Ryan, before we finish, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about HR Dive and your role there and what HR Dive offers to our audience, our human resources professionals that listen to us.
I'm happy to. HR Dive is an HR news focused B2B news publication. It is online only, and we offer a suite of newsletters that cover areas including training, talent development, compensation and benefits, D&I. Where it's a very comprehensive sort of overview of what HR is today. We cover the most relevant HR news that includes regulations, policies. We have trackers on our website for things like salary history bands. I could link to all of it really, but there's so much, and it's completely free. Our newsletters are free to sign up for, and we send two daily newsletters out each week with a couple of weeklies thrown in for a specific topic area. So if you're a compensation and benefits professional, you're going to want to subscribe to our Thursday compensation and benefits newsletter. We simply try to provide as much of a scope about HR as we can. I'm a reporter there, one of two, and we have several writers who are constantly interviewing HR executives and trying to get the most accurate information that we can about what current practice is in the industry.
I can tell you that the projections team loves HR Dive. You guys report on all the things that matter the most to us. I want to let everybody know that links to HR Dive, as well as Ryan's article on Tesla, will be included in this episode's companion guide. So be sure to sign up for that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Ryan, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions we ask every guest of the podcast. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. So our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about updating employee handbooks. But in your opinion, which is harder to update, your computer's operating system or your wardrobe?
This is a funny one. I think like my computer's operating system just kind of does it itself these days. I have a Mac, so I see it just update overnight, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. My wardrobe, on the other hand, I think needs a little bit of updating. My outfit has been like sweatpants and t-shirt for the past, 6 months. So I'm sure it could really use some updating at this point.
I'm sure that's true of most of us after we've all stayed home for this long, stopped paying attention to what we're wearing. So tell me, what's the best book that you've read recently?
I want to point out a book that I read over the summer called Super Pumped, The Battle for Uber. It's a book by Mike Isaac, who is a New York Times tech reporter. Mike dives into the history of Uber and where it came from, the founding of it, and why it was founded. It's a very interesting look at Silicon Valley and why these companies grow to be as big as they are, the troubles that they face. Again, there's a huge section on the controversies of Uber, but also the successes and the evolution of the company through the present day. I found it a really enlightening read about business. Uber is, of course, a company we watch a lot on HR Dive because they touch the industry in so many ways. So, I totally recommend Super Pumped by Mike Isaac.
Love that, and I love the Uber Genesis story where they're standing on a street corner in Paris and can't get a ride, and so I'll have to pick that up. I would enjoy reading that. So tell me, what's your favorite thing about reporting on human resources issues?
I just love how meta it is, for lack of a better word, because we are, constantly working a job, and we're learning about how other people work their jobs and about how HR intersects with all that. And we're learning about the future of work and automation and all these topics that may sound kind of nerdy, but at the end of the day, I find them very exciting and very interesting. We're learning about what work will look like in 10, 20 years, and all these crazy employment laws. Like, I'm not even sure if employees really know how much change is going on in the employment law space, but it impacts how they work and it impacts the rights that they have. So I find it very interesting, a very interesting subject. And again, I just love talking to employers. There's so many cool stories out there just waiting to be told.
I agree. I don't think it's nerdy at all. I think it's fascinating. So tell me what the best piece of advice you've ever been given is.
I was thinking about this one a lot, and I wanted to cite a piece of advice I got from a high school teacher, which was beware of time thieves. And I remember when he told me that, I was kind of, questioning what that meant, but he was really talking about distractions and small things that sort of interrupt your progress day to day on whatever you're working on. So he sort of sat me down and told me to focus on 5 or 6 things and actually physically write them down, in a bulleted list or a checklist to focus on every day. And I've followed that advice ever since, and it has helped me keep on task, especially these days with the amount of things we have going on, working remote and dealing with distractions and reading the news. It just helps to have 5 or 6 things to focus on and avoid distractions and things that kind of throw you off chart, if you know what I mean.
Beware of time thieves. I think I'm going to get that framed and put right over my desk. I like that. So last question, who or what inspires you?
Yeah, I want to give a couple shout outs here. I just wanted to, really shout out my family, my parents, my younger brother, and my grandparents, aunts and uncles. It's been a tough year for everybody, but my family's been showing incredible strength, and they're an inspiration to me every day. I thank them so much for their support, and it's been meant a lot to be able to talk to them throughout everything. I want to shout out to my HR Dive team. We do an excellent job reporting on all these crazy developments that are happening. And I want to say thank you to everybody from managing editor to associate editor to reporter. They all do a fantastic job, and you should totally read their work, not just mine. And lastly, a shout out to my fiance, who is a 4th-year medical student. She is an inspiration to me every day. She's doing all the patient interaction, all the testing, all the studying, and she's kicked butt through it all. So I really appreciate her, and she's just an inspiration to me. So.
Ryan, I think you've just inspired all of us with that little dose of gratitude right there. I love that. Thank you so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Ryan.
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it.
And thanks to our listeners. And as always, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. And as we've been telling you over the last few weeks, this November marks Project HR's 1-year anniversary, and we are celebrating with a fantastic book giveaway. One lucky listener is going to win a copy of every book featured on the podcast this year. That's well over a dozen titles from some of today's hottest business authors, just for being a Project HR listener. So stay tuned for more information on how to enter to win. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.